There is something almost unsettling about the first time you learn what the stomach is actually doing. Not what it does in the broad, familiar sense, receiving food, breaking it down, passing it along, but what it is doing at every second of every hour of your entire life, including right now. Because the stomach is not simply a bag, it is not a container waiting to be filled and emptied. It is an organ that is perpetually, relentlessly working to destroy itself. And the only thing preventing it from doing exactly that is a system of biological protection so precise, so intricately balanced, that scientists are still uncovering how all of it holds together. That tension between an organ that produces acid corrosive enough to dissolve metal and a lining thin enough to be measured in fractions of an inch is the story of the stomach. And once you understand it, the organ you have carried your entire life will never seem ordinary again. The stomach sits in the upper left portion of the abdomen, tucked beneath the diaphragm and cradled by the liver on one side and the spleen on the other. In an adult, when empty, it is roughly the size of a large fist and holds just a few ounces of space. When fully expanded after a meal, it can stretch to hold more than a quart of food and liquid. That range, from compressed and nearly flat to dramatically distended, is made possible by a feature of the stomach's interior that most people have never heard of, but whose function is immediately intuitive once explained. The inner surface of the stomach is not smooth. It is folded. These folds, called rugae, run like ridges along the inner wall, and they serve the same purpose as the accordion pleats in a flexible bag. They allow the stomach to collapse when empty and open when full. Run a finger along the inside of a deflated balloon before you blow it up, and you feel something like what the rugae are doing. A redundancy of surface stored in folds, waiting to be deployed. The stomach, in its resting state, is already preparing for the next meal. But understanding the stomach begins before food ever arrives. It begins with structure. The organ is divided into 4 anatomical regions, each with a distinct function, each contributing to a process that begins the moment you take your first bite. And in some ways, even before that. At the top, where the esophagus meets the stomach, is the cardia. This region surrounds the cardiac sphincter, a ring of muscle that acts as a controlled gateway between the food passage above and the stomach below. Its job is to open when food needs to pass in and close tightly enough to prevent the stomach's acidic contents from traveling back upward. When this mechanism fails, even partially, the result is the burning sensation most people recognize as heartburn. Not a heart problem at all, but acid briefly making contact with esophageal tissue never designed to withstand it. Just above and to the left of the cardia is the fundus, the dome-shaped upper portion of the stomach that extends above the level of the opening. The fundus is where swallowed air collects, which is why a full stomach produces burping. And it also stores food briefly after arrival, functioning as an intake reservoir before the real work of digestion begins. The largest section of the stomach is the body, or corpus. This is where the majority of mechanical and chemical processing takes place. The walls of the body are layered in a way that is unlike most organs in the human body, and that structural difference is the key to understanding how the stomach manages to do what it does without destroying itself. Most hollow organs, the bladder, the gallbladder, the small intestine, have walls made of 2 layers of smooth muscle arranged in a circular pattern and a longitudinal one. The stomach has 3. Beneath the inner mucosal lining, there are circular fibers, then diagonal fibers, then longitudinal fibers running in 3 distinct directions. This triple-layered musculature means that when the stomach contracts, it does not simply squeeze, it churns. It rolls and twists its contents in multiple directions simultaneously, the way hands knead dough rather than simply pressing it. This mechanical action is called peristalsis in the general sense, but in the stomach it produces something more complex. A grinding, mixing, tumbling motion that reduces solid food to a semi-liquid paste called chyme. The stomach is, in one of its most essential functions, a biological blender, one with carefully orchestrated muscular intelligence built into its very walls. As the body processes food mechanically, it is simultaneously bathing those contents in chemistry. And this is where the stomach's story becomes genuinely strange. The gastric lining is studded with millions of microscopic structures called gastric glands. These glands contain several different types of specialized cells, each producing a different substance, and together they generate what is known as gastric juice, a mixture whose properties are extreme by any biological standard. The parietal cells within these glands secrete hydrochloric acid at a concentration that gives the stomach's contents a pH between 1 and 2. For comparison, battery acid has a pH of around 0. Lemon juice sits near 2.5. The stomach, in full operation after a meal, is generating an environment nearly as acidic as anything found in industrial chemistry. Inside a living human being, surrounded by organs, blood vessels, and tissue, this acid serves multiple purposes. It denatures proteins, meaning it unfolds and begins to break apart the complex molecular structures of meat, legumes, and other protein-containing foods, making them more accessible to digestive enzymes. It kills a significant portion of the bacteria and pathogens that arrive with food and water, a function so important that people who suppress stomach acid with medication for prolonged periods sometimes show increased vulnerability to certain gut infections. And it activates an enzyme called pepsin, which is the stomach's primary protein digesting tool. Pepsin does not exist in its active form until it is needed. It is secreted by chief cells in the gastric glands as an inactive precursor called pepsinogen. When pepsinogen contacts the hydrochloric acid already present in the stomach, it undergoes a structural change and becomes pepsin, capable of cleaving proteins into shorter chains that the small intestine can later absorb. This two-step activation is not accidental. It is a safety mechanism. An enzyme powerful enough to break down proteins in general should not be active inside the cells that produce it. The stomach keeps pepsin dormant until the moment it is released into an environment acidic enough to transform it, and only then does it go to work. The body, in this arrangement, is carrying a controlled weapon, one that arms itself only when conditions are right. The acid, then, is not a byproduct. It is an instrument, and this raises the question that defines the stomach's biology more than any other. If the stomach produces enough acid to dissolve metal, why doesn't it dissolve itself? The answer involves a layer of protection called the mucosa, the innermost of the stomach's several wall layers, and specifically a coating it produces called the mucus barrier. Specialized cells throughout the gastric lining, called mucus neck cells and surface epithelial cells, continuously secrete a thick, gel-like layer of mucus that coats the inner surface of the stomach. This layer is not simply slippery, it is chemically alkaline. While the stomach's interior pH is hovering between 1 and 2, the pH of the mucus layer immediately adjacent to the stomach wall is significantly higher, closer to neutral, around 7. The acid never reaches the cells of the lining directly. It is held at bay by a gradient, corrosive outside, protected within. But the mucus barrier alone is not sufficient. If a single breach occurs, if even a small patch of lining loses its protection, the acid immediately begins to damage underlying tissue. The stomach anticipates this. The epithelial cells of the gastric lining are among the fastest replacing cells in the human body. The surface layer of the stomach's interior is completely renewed approximately every 3 to 5 days. Cells that are damaged or lost are replaced almost before the damage fully registers. The stomach is not preventing injury so much as it is outpacing it. A continuous regeneration matched to a continuous threat. When this regeneration falls behind, or when the mucus barrier is compromised, the result is a peptic ulcer, a wound in the stomach lining where acid has made contact with unprotected tissue. For decades, ulcers were attributed primarily to stress and diet, a belief so entrenched it resisted medical revision for years. The actual discovery that most peptic ulcers are caused by a bacterial infection from a microorganism called Helicobacter pylori was one of the more striking realignments in 20th century medicine. H. pylori is one of the few organisms capable of surviving in the stomach's acid environment. It does so by producing an enzyme that neutralizes acid locally, creating a small alkaline microenvironment in which the bacterium can embed itself in the mucus layer. Once there, it gradually undermines the mucosal barrier, allowing acid contact with the underlying tissue. This insight, that what appeared to be a lifestyle disease was in fact a bacterial infection, transformed the treatment of ulcers entirely. What once required surgery or lifelong medication is now routinely addressed with a short course of antibiotics. Below the body of the stomach, narrowing toward the lower right, lies the antrum, the region responsible for processing and controlling output. The antrum is the most muscular portion of the stomach, and its contractions are the most powerful. It grinds food against the pylorus, the final section of the stomach, pummeling material repeatedly until particles are small enough to pass through. Anything too large is churned back into the body for further processing. The stomach does not release food arbitrarily. It filters. At the boundary between the stomach and the small intestine sits the pyloric sphincter, a thick muscular valve that regulates exactly how much chyme is released at any given moment and at what rate. This regulation matters more than it might seem. The small intestine can only process a limited volume of acidic material at once. Release too much too quickly, and digestion becomes inefficient and potentially damaging to the intestinal lining. The pyloric sphincter receives hormonal signals from the small intestine itself, specifically a hormone called secretin, released when the duodenum detects acid arriving, that cause it to slow or pause its release. The stomach does not operate in isolation. It is in constant chemical conversation with everything downstream. This hormonal signaling is part of a broader network that governs everything the stomach does. Long before food arrives, the brain initiates gastric activity. The sight, smell, and anticipation of food trigger the vagus nerve, one of the longest nerves in the body, running from the brainstem all the way to the abdomen, to send signals telling the stomach to begin secreting acid and preparing the muscular churning cycle. This response, known as the cephalic phase of digestion, can account for as much as half of the acid secreted during an entire meal, produced before a single bite is swallowed. The stomach begins the act of digestion in imagination before it begins it in fact. Once food arrives, a second phase begins. The distension of the stomach walls by incoming food activates stretch receptors in the mucosa. These receptors stimulate local nerves and trigger additional hormone release, including gastrin, a hormone secreted by G cells in the stomach lining that drives further acid production and increases the strength of muscular contractions. Gastrin, acid, pepsin, and mucus work in coordinated sequence, each layer of chemistry responding to the changing conditions inside the organ in real time. There is also a less commonly discussed function of the stomach that sits at the intersection of nutrition and cellular biology. The parietal cells that produce hydrochloric acid also produce a protein called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor has nothing to do with digestion in the conventional sense. Its sole purpose is to bind with vitamin B12, a nutrient absorbed not in the stomach but much further downstream in the small intestine, and protect it as it travels through the digestive system until it reaches the specific region of the intestine capable of absorbing it. Without intrinsic factor, vitamin B12 absorption fails almost entirely. Without adequate B12, the body cannot produce healthy red blood cells and neurological function begins to deteriorate. The stomach, then, is not only breaking down food, it is enabling nutrient absorption that will occur far from it, in organs it never directly contacts, for processes that unfold across weeks and months rather than hours. The stomach also has what researchers now recognize as its own nervous system, or more precisely, a deeply embedded branch of the enteric nervous system, the network of neurons that lines the entire gastrointestinal tract. The stomach contains millions of neurons capable of processing information, coordinating muscular activity, and communicating with the brain through the vagus nerve. This bidirectional communication is currently a significant area of research. Evidence suggests that the gut-brain axis, the signaling pathway connecting gastric and intestinal activity to brain function, may influence mood, stress response, and cognitive states in ways that are still being mapped. Studies indicate that disruptions to the microbiome and gut signaling are associated with changes in neurological and psychological function, though there is still no full consensus on the precise mechanisms at work. The stomach is not simply a digestive organ. It is, in some sense, that science is still articulating, part of the body's broader sense of its own internal state. Fasting, stress, medications, infections, and aging all alter the stomach's function in measurable ways. Acid secretion declines somewhat with age, which affects both digestion and the protective killing of ingested bacteria. Certain common medications, including non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin and ibuprofen, inhibit the production of prostaglandins, molecules that normally help maintain the mucus barrier. This is why prolonged use of these drugs is associated with gastric irritation and ulcers, independent of any bacterial involvement. The stomach's protection is not passive. It requires active, ongoing chemical maintenance, and anything that interferes with that maintenance risks uncovering the tissue beneath. Research continues to explore how the stomach adapts to extreme conditions. Studies of bariatric surgery, procedures that reduce the size of the stomach or reroute the digestive tract entirely, have revealed that the organ plays roles in metabolic regulation that were not previously understood. Patients who undergo certain types of bariatric procedures show improvements in blood sugar regulation and type 2 diabetes resolution that occur far faster than weight loss alone can explain, suggesting that the stomach and upper gastrointestinal tract are involved in metabolic signaling in ways that are still being worked out. The stomach, it seems, communicates with the pancreas, the liver, and the endocrine system in ways that extend well beyond digestion. What all of this amounts to is a portrait of an organ that is simultaneously more ordinary and more extraordinary than its popular image suggests. It is not a simple acid bath. It is not merely a holding chamber. It is a precisely calibrated chemical reactor, a mechanical processor, a hormonal signaling node, a neurological component, and a gateway that the body uses to regulate what it takes in, what it destroys, what it preserves, and what it sends onward. Every meal you eat passes through this organ. Every protein you have ever absorbed was first partially unfolded in its acid. Every vitamin B12 molecule your nervous system has ever used was first bound to a protein produced by cells in your stomach lining. Every act of eating has required the stomach to walk the same narrow biological line, producing enough acid to process food, generating enough mucus to survive itself, contracting with enough force to grind and enough control to release at exactly the right rate. There is something quietly astonishing in recognizing that this has been happening in your body since before you were born, and that the organ managing all of it is one you have almost certainly never thought about on a day when it was working perfectly. The stomach, like most of the body's great achievements, is most invisible when it is doing exactly what it was built to do. And yet, all of this happens in silence, without conscious effort, without you even noticing. Right now, your stomach is producing acid powerful enough to break down what you eat, activating enzymes that dismantle complex molecules, renewing its own cellular lining before damage can even take hold, and regulating with precise control what it releases and what it holds back. It is not just an organ. It is a system balancing destruction and protection at the same time, every second since before you were born. And perhaps the most astonishing part is that it works so well you rarely think about it at all. But now that you understand it, the next time you eat, you'll know this is not a simple process. It's an extraordinary biological choreography unfolding inside you. If you want to keep exploring how your body makes the impossible possible, subscribe to Anatomy Unlocked and join us on the next journey into what you truly are beneath the surface.